On the morning of August 15, 1945, somewhere over the grey expanse of the Sea of Okhotsk, Lieutenant James Harrington banked his P-38 Lightning into a slow turn and felt his heart stop beating for what seemed like an eternity. Below him, cutting through the morning mist like ghosts emerging from the underworld, flew a formation of fighters that made no sense whatsoever. They were unmistakably American in design, the distinctive tricycle landing gear, the sleek nose housing that massive cannon, the elegant sweep of wings he had seen 1,000 times in training manuals and at airfields across the continental United States. But these aircraft bore no white stars. Instead, their wings and fuselages were adorned with bold red stars, the unmistakable insignia of the Soviet Union. Harrington's gloved hand trembled on the control stick as his mind raced to process what his eyes were telling him. These were Bell P-63 King Cobras, American fighters that had never been deployed in combat by any American unit in the Pacific. Yet here they were, dozens of them, flying in tight formation toward the Kuril Islands, their Soviet pilots seemingly oblivious to the American lightnings circling above them. In that moment, Harrington became one of the first American combat pilots to witness firsthand one of the war's most carefully guarded secrets. A secret that had been ferried across thousands of miles of frozen wilderness, negotiated in the highest corridors of power, and was now being unleashed in the war's final chaotic days. The story of how American fighters came to fly under Soviet colors in the Pacific began not in the skies over Asia, but in the frozen heartland of Alaska, a place called Ladd Field near Fairbanks. In 1942, as the war consumed the world in flames that stretched from the steppes of Russia to the jungles of New Guinea, American and Soviet leaders recognized that their alliance, forged in the desperate furnace of necessity rather than ideological kinship, required more than diplomatic pleasantries and optimistic cables. The Soviet Union was hemorrhaging men and machines at a rate that defied comprehension. German panzers had thrust deep into Russian territory, and the Red Air Force had suffered catastrophic losses in the opening months of Operation Barbarossa. Stalin's factories, many hastily relocated beyond the Ural Mountains, were churning out aircraft as fast as humanly possible, but it wasn't enough. The mathematics of survival demanded outside help. Enter the Lend-Lease program, that remarkable arrangement through which the United States agreed to supply its allies with the materiel of war. For the Soviet Union, this meant everything from boots to tanks, from canned meat that Russian soldiers called Second Front to locomotives and machine tools. But perhaps nothing embodied the strange alliance more than the aircraft program, specifically the Alaska-Siberia route that would become known as ALSIB. This was no ordinary supply line. It stretched over 6,000 miles from Great Falls, Montana, through the Canadian wilderness, across Alaska, over the Bering Strait, and deep into the frozen heart of Siberia, terminating at Krasnoyarsk, from where the aircraft would fan out to various fronts. The route passed through some of the most inhospitable terrain on Earth, where temperatures could plunge to 60 degrees below zero, and where a mechanical failure meant almost certain death. At Ladd Field, American and Soviet personnel worked side by side in an atmosphere of wary cooperation that reflected the broader tensions of the alliance. The base became a strange microcosm of the wartime relationship, a place where two vastly different cultures attempted to collaborate on a mission of vital importance while never quite trusting each other completely. American mechanics would prepare the aircraft, many of them fresh from the Bell factory in Buffalo, New York, ensuring that every engine, every control surface, every instrument was functioning perfectly. The Soviets, for their part, would inspect each aircraft with an almost obsessive thoroughness that sometimes frustrated their American counterparts. Every rivet was examined, every seal tested, every gauge calibrated. The Americans initially saw this as excessive pickiness, evidence of the Russians' suspicious nature. The Soviet inspectors knew something their American allies could not fully appreciate. The journey that lay ahead through Siberia made the Alaska leg look like a pleasure cruise, and any mechanical deficiency that seemed minor in the relative comfort of Fairbanks could prove fatal in the vast emptiness of the Soviet Far East. The first aircraft to traverse the route were Douglas A-20 Havocs, twin-engine light bombers that the Soviets would use with devastating effectiveness against German armor. Lieutenant Colonel Pavel Nedosekin led the inaugural group of 12 A-20s out of Fairbanks on September 3, 1942, their departure marking the beginning of an aerial bridge that would eventually deliver nearly 8,000 aircraft to the Soviet Union. But it was the fighters, particularly the Bell P-39 Airacobra and its successor, the P-63 King Cobra, that would become the workhorses of the ALSEB route and the subject of Lieutenant Harrington's astonishment on that August morning. The P-39 Airacobra had been something of a disappointment to American and British pilots. Its unconventional design, with the engine mounted behind the pilot and a cannon firing through the propeller hub, had promised much, but delivered less in the high-altitude combat that characterized the war in Western Europe and the Pacific. But the Soviets saw something in the Airacobra that others had missed. The fighting on the Eastern Front was different, conducted at lower altitudes where the P-39's performance characteristics shone. Soviet pilots fell in love with the aircraft's rugged construction, its heavy firepower, and its responsive handling at the altitudes where they typically engaged German aircraft. The romance between Russian pilots and American Bell fighters became one of the war's most remarkable stories. Alexander Pokrishkin, who would become the second highest-scoring Soviet ace of the war, flew P-39s and P-63s to devastating effect, scoring dozens of his victories in these American machines. Other aces followed suit, and soon the Airacobra and King Cobra became synonymous with Soviet air superiority on the Eastern Front. But there was a condition attached to the delivery of the more advanced P-63 King Cobra, a condition that would make Harrington's sighting all the more significant. In 1943, as deliveries of the King Cobra began, American officials insisted that these aircraft be held in reserve in the Soviet Far East, ostensibly to build up forces for the eventual Soviet entry into the war against Japan. This was no mere suggestion, but a formal agreement, a recognition that while the Soviets desperately needed aircraft to fight the Germans, the United States had strategic interests in the Pacific that required Soviet participation. Stalin, ever the pragmatist, agreed to the terms, though he had his own reasons for accumulating forces in the Far East. Whether the Soviets actually honored this agreement became one of the war's minor mysteries. German pilots over the Eastern Front reported encountering King Cobras, their distinctive four-bladed propellers and enlarged tail surfaces unmistakable even in the heat of combat. Hans-Ulrich Rudel, the Luftwaffe's most decorated pilot, explicitly mentioned fighting against Airacobras, King Cobras and Bostons over the Kurland pocket in 1944 and 1945. Soviet records naturally made no mention of King Cobras serving on the European front. On paper, every P-63 delivered remained obediently in the Soviet Far East, awaiting the day when Moscow would finally turn its attention to Japan. This bureaucratic fiction suited both sides perfectly. The Americans maintained the illusion of their agreement being honored, while the Soviets used whatever equipment they needed, wherever they needed it. The reality of total war had a way of trumping diplomatic niceties. For the American ferry pilots who flew these aircraft from the factories to Alaska, the mission was both crucial and anonymous. They included women of the Women Air Force Service Pilots Program, skilled aviators who ferried aircraft across the continental United States with professional excellence that belied the discrimination they faced. These pilots would deliver the aircraft to Nome or Fairbanks, where Soviet pilots would take over for the perilous journey across the Bering Strait. The handover was always a moment of quiet tension. Two sets of pilots, enemies by ideology but allies by circumstance, exchanging aircraft that represented the incredible productive capacity of American industry. The Soviets who arrived in Alaska were mostly combat veterans, men who had survived the brutal fighting on the Eastern Front and who saw the ferrying duty as a welcome respite from constant danger. They came with the weariness of men who had seen too much death, but also with a professional intensity that the Americans couldn't help but respect. Communication between the two groups was always challenging. The base newspaper at Lad Field published helpful Russian phrases, and some Americans took classes in the language, but more often than not, communication happened through gestures, diagrams, and the universal language of professional pilots discussing their craft. There were moments of genuine connection, times when the shared experience of flying transcended political boundaries. A Soviet pilot might mime a combat maneuver, and his American counterpart would understand immediately, nodding in recognition of a universal truth about aerial warfare. There were also moments of cultural friction, differences in approach and attitude that reflected deeper ideological divides. The Soviets were accompanied by political officers whose presence ensured that fraternization remained within acceptable bounds. Any Soviet who showed too much enthusiasm for American ways would face serious consequences upon returning home. The Americans found the Soviet shopping habits particularly amusing. When the Russian pilots weren't flying or inspecting aircraft, they were often to be found in Fairbanks stores, buying up everything they could find. Shoes in every size, fabric, tools, luxury items that were impossible to obtain in the war-ravaged Soviet Union. One American officer recalled a Soviet pilot approaching a shoe store clerk and asking to buy shoes. When the clerk inquired about the type and size, the Russian simply said he wanted all kinds in all sizes. The clerk ended up selling him the entire previous year's stock. These goods would be loaded onto the aircraft for the journey to Siberia, personal treasures that the pilots hoped would make it back to their families. It was a poignant reminder that beneath the ideology and the political rhetoric, these were men separated from their loved ones, fighting a war that had consumed their homeland and seeking small comforts that might ease their families' suffering. As the war in Europe wound down and Germany's defeat became inevitable, attention increasingly turned to the Pacific. Stalin had promised Roosevelt at Yalta that the Soviet Union would enter the war against Japan within 3 months of Germany's surrender. It was a promise made with strategic calculation on both sides. The Americans wanted Soviet help in defeating Japan, believing it would save American lives in what promised to be a bloody invasion of the Japanese home islands. Stalin wanted territorial concessions in the Far East, a return of lands lost to Japan in the 1904-1905 war, and a seat at the table in determining the post-war order in Asia. The clock started ticking on May 8, 1945, when Germany surrendered, and in the Soviet Far East, preparations for a massive offensive accelerated. The King Cobras that had been steadily accumulating began moving to forward bases, their pilots training for a type of combat quite different from the grinding attritional warfare of the Eastern Front. Lieutenant Harrington knew none of this as he flew his patrol over the Sea of Okhotsk on that August morning. His mission was routine, searching for any remaining Japanese naval activity in these northern waters. The war had bypassed this region for the most part, the main thrust of American operations focusing on the island-hopping campaign that had brought forces ever closer to Japan itself. The Northern Pacific remained something of a strategic backwater, important enough to patrol but not critical enough to dominate American strategic thinking. Harrington had flown P-38 since his training, and he loved the twin-engine fighter, with the affection that combat pilots often developed for the machines that kept them alive. The Lightning's range made it perfect for these long overwater patrols, and its firepower provided reassurance should he encounter any Japanese aircraft. But Japanese aircraft were not what he encountered that morning. As he descended through the clouds to get a better look at the formation below him, Harrington's confusion deepened. These were definitely P-63s, and they were definitely bearing Soviet markings. His radio crackled with his wingman's voice, confirming that he was seeing the same thing. Neither pilot had been briefed on any Soviet operations in this area, and the sight of American-designed aircraft in Soviet service was jarring enough to require several moments of mental recalibration. Harrington's training kicked in, and he made no hostile moves, recognizing the red stars for what they were. But his mind raced with questions. Why were Soviets here? Where were they going? And why were they flying American fighters that supposedly didn't exist in combat service? What Harrington was witnessing was the opening moves of Operation August Storm, the Soviet invasion of Manchuria that would become one of the war's most decisive campaigns. On August 8, 1945, Soviet Foreign Minister Vyacheslav Molotov had informed the Japanese ambassador that the Soviet Union would be at war with Japan as of August 9th. True to Stalin's word at Yalta, exactly 3 months after Germany's surrender, over 1.5 million Soviet troops launched a massive offensive against Japanese forces in Manchuria, Korea, and the Kuril Islands. It was a campaign of staggering scope, involving 3 main fronts that would execute a vast pincer movement designed to crush the Japanese Kwantung Army. The air component of this operation relied heavily on those Lend-Lease aircraft that had been accumulating in the Soviet Far East, and the P-63 King Cobras were finally being deployed for their officially designated purpose. The King Cobras flew escort missions for Soviet bombers attacking Japanese positions, conducted ground attack operations against fortifications and troop concentrations, and provided air cover for the rapidly advancing ground forces. On August 15th, the same day Harrington spotted them, Soviet P-63s were supporting operations against Japanese positions on the Kuril Islands, those volcanic islands stretching like stepping stones between Japan and the Kamchatka Peninsula. The 888th and 410th Fighter Aviation Regiments flew from bases on Kamchatka, their King Cobras diving on Japanese installations with that devastating 37mm cannon that could penetrate armor and destroy bunkers. Lieutenant Miroshnichenko achieved what is believed to be the first air-to-air victory for the P-63 in Soviet service when he shot down a Japanese Ki-43 Hayabusa off the coast of North Korea. The Soviet pilots found the Japanese opposition surprisingly light, years of attrition having bled the Japanese Air Forces white, but they flew their missions with the same intensity they had brought to fighting the Luftwaffe. For Harrington, circling above this formation, the geopolitical implications were beyond his immediate concern. His focus was on avoiding any incident that might create diplomatic problems, or worse, result in friendly fire casualties. He radioed back to base, reporting what he was seeing, and was instructed to maintain observation but take no hostile action. The Soviets were allies, he was reminded, even if their presence in this area had not been anticipated. Harrington watched as the formation droned steadily toward their target, P-63s maintaining a disciplined formation that spoke of experienced leadership. He wondered about the pilots in those cockpits, what they had experienced in the years of fighting Germany, what they thought about flying American aircraft against Japanese forces, whether they felt the same sense of unreality that he felt watching them. The sight of those Soviet King Cobras represented something larger than just a tactical surprise. It was a moment when the complex realities of the war's end became visible in the sky, a physical manifestation of the alliance's contradictions and convergences. Here were American aircraft, built by American workers, tested by American engineers, flown by Soviet pilots who had learned their trade in the killing skies over the Eastern Front, now being used against Japan in a campaign that would reshape the geopolitical landscape of Asia for decades to come. The Red Army's invasion of Manchuria would prove to be swift and devastating. The Japanese Kwantung Army, once Japan's most formidable force, collapsing under the weight of Soviet armor and air power in less than 2 weeks. Soviet forces would advance hundreds of miles, capturing territory, taking prisoners, and fundamentally altering the balance of power in the region. The role of those Lend-Lease aircraft in this campaign was significant, if not decisive. The P-63s and P-39s provided the tactical air support that allowed Soviet ground forces to maintain their rapid advance. They bombed fortifications, strafed convoys, and engaged the scattered remnants of Japanese air power that attempted to oppose the onslaught. For the Soviet pilots, it was a different kind of combat than they had known on the Eastern Front. The distances were vast, the enemy less formidable, but the danger was still real. Anti-aircraft fire from Japanese positions claimed several aircraft, and the rugged terrain of Manchuria and the Kuril Islands posed its own hazards. Still, the campaign was remarkable for its speed and effectiveness, a testament to Soviet planning and the quality of the equipment, including those American fighters, that made such rapid operations possible. Harrington returned to base with his report, which was received with more interest than surprise by his commanding officers. The Soviet entry into the war against Japan had been announced, and intelligence services were scrambling to piece together the scope of Soviet operations. Harrington's sighting of the P-63 formation was one piece of a larger puzzle that American intelligence was trying to assemble. The presence of American aircraft in Soviet service was known at the highest levels, of course, but the specifics of their deployment were not always shared with tactical units like Harrington's. His report joined countless others in the intelligence files, documentation of a war that was rapidly drawing to a close, but whose consequences would echo for generations. In the days that followed Harrington's sighting, Japan announced its surrender, Emperor Hirohito's broadcast reaching a stunned nation on August 15th. But the fighting did not immediately cease. Soviet forces continued their advance in Manchuria, and the King Cobras continued their missions. There were complications as Japanese commanders, confused by the surrender announcement and uncertain of their orders, either fought on or attempted to surrender to various Soviet units. The P-63s flew overhead during these final chaotic days, their presence a constant reminder of Soviet air superiority in the region. By the time hostilities officially ended in September, Soviet forces had occupied Manchuria, Northern Korea, and the Kuril Islands, territorial gains that would have lasting implications for the Cold War that followed. For the aircraft themselves, the end of the war meant different things. Some P-63s remained in Soviet service for years after the war, used as trainers or in air defense units. The tricycle landing gear that had seemed like an oddity for American pilots made the King Cobra valuable for transitioning Soviet pilots to jet aircraft, which also featured nose-wheel configurations. Other P-63s were gradually retired as Soviet aircraft production caught up and eventually surpassed wartime levels with indigenous designs. The Lend-Lease agreements technically required the return of equipment after the war, but the reality of the burgeoning Cold War made such provisions largely moot. Some equipment was returned, but much of it remained in Soviet hands, a source of ongoing tension between Washington and Moscow. The P-63s that had survived the war in Soviet service were not among the equipment returned, their fate tied to the new geopolitical realities that made former allies into competitors. Lieutenant Harrington's encounter with those Soviet King Cobras remained a vivid memory for the rest of his life. He would tell the story to his children and grandchildren, the moment when the war's complexities revealed themselves in the most unexpected way. Here he was, an American pilot, watching American fighters in Soviet service flying against Japanese forces, all in a theater of war he hadn't realized was active. It was a reminder that war, for all its planning and strategy, always contained elements of surprise and irony. The aircraft that American factories had produced with such effort, that American ferry pilots had delivered with such dedication, that Soviet inspectors had examined with such care, were now tools in a geopolitical game that extended far beyond the immediate military considerations. The Al-Saibi route would close shortly after the war's end, its mission complete. The thousands of aircraft it had delivered had contributed to the Soviet war effort in ways that were both measurable and incalculable. The P-39s and P-63s had helped turn the tide on the Eastern Front, their firepower and reliability giving Soviet pilots aircraft they could trust in the desperate fighting against the Luftwaffe. The same aircraft had then participated in the final campaign of the war, helping to crush Japanese resistance in Manchuria and thereby hastening the war's end. But the route had delivered more than just aircraft. It had created a point of contact between two superpowers who would soon become adversaries, a place where Americans and Soviets had worked together despite their differences, where they had shared knowledge and skills across ideological divides. The legacy of those encounters, both the collaboration at Lad Field and the aerial sightings like Harrington's, would become increasingly complex as the Cold War deepened. The warm cooperation of the wartime alliance gave way to suspicion and hostility. The same skies where Harrington had watched Soviet King Cobras would become potential battlegrounds as the two superpowers faced off across the North Pacific. The lessons learned from operating alongside the Soviets, from understanding their methods and their capabilities, would inform American thinking for decades. And somewhere in the Soviet Union, those King Cobras that had made such a journey, from American factories through Canadian wilderness, across Siberian emptiness, to finally see combat against Japan, continued to fly under red stars, physical reminders of an alliance that had served its purpose but could not survive the peace. The story of American fighters under Soviet colors in the Pacific represents one of the war's great ironies. These aircraft, rejected by American forces as inferior to the P-51 Mustang, found their greatest success in Soviet hands. The pilots who flew them achieved some of the war's highest scores, proving that the right aircraft in the right circumstances, flown by determined pilots, could achieve remarkable results. The fact that they were never used in combat by American forces only adds to the irony. American industrial might created these machines. American ingenuity designed their unique characteristics, but it was Soviet courage and tactical acumen that proved their worth in battle. And in the end, it was American eyes that witnessed them in their final combat deployment, a moment when all the threads of the war, the alliances and the production and the strategy converged in the skies over the Pacific. For those who study the war, the sight of P-63 King Cobras bearing red stars serves as a powerful reminder of the war's complexity. It challenges the simple narratives that often reduce the conflict to straightforward confrontations between good and evil. The reality was messier, an alliance of necessity between powers with fundamentally different worldviews, cooperation driven by pragmatic calculation rather than shared values, and outcomes that served multiple interests in ways that defied easy categorization. The Soviet pilots flying American fighters were simultaneously allies and future adversaries, partners in defeating a common enemy and competitors in the struggle that would follow. The aircraft they flew embodied these contradictions, products of American capitalism serving Soviet communism in a war against Japanese imperialism. Harrington's story, and the countless similar encounters that occurred in those final days of the war, deserve to be remembered not just as historical curiosities, but as windows into the war's true nature. They remind us that even in moments of apparent simplicity, when good battles evil and allies fight together, the reality contains layers of complexity that only become visible upon closer examination. The sight of those American fighters under Soviet command, flying missions that American forces never flew, against enemies that American pilots never engaged in those particular skies, encapsulates the strange, ironic, and ultimately human nature of global conflict. And as those P-63s disappeared into the morning mist, heading toward their targets on the Kuril Islands, they carried with them the hopes and fears of multiple nations, the ingenuity of American engineers, the skill of Soviet pilots, and the weight of a war that was finally mercifully drawing to its close. The memory of those encounters lives on in the historical record, and the stories passed down by veterans like Harrington, and in the few surviving aircraft that bear witness to this remarkable chapter of the war. They remind us that victory in the Second World War came not just through American effort alone, but through a complex web of alliances, supply chains, and tactical decisions that spanned continents. The sight of American fighters bearing Soviet stars in the Pacific skies serves as a testament to that complexity, a physical manifestation of how the war was truly won through cooperation, even when that cooperation was fraught with tension and born of necessity. And as we look back on that history, we can appreciate how moments of surprise, like Harrington's encounter, reveal truths about the war that simple narratives often obscure, truths about alliance and rivalry, about industry and courage, and about the strange ways that nations come together in times of crisis, only to drift apart when the crisis passes. If you found this journey through history compelling, consider exploring more of these forgotten stories that shaped our world. For in understanding the complexity of the past, we gain wisdom for navigating the complexities of our present and future.